now. Come with me now.
Go with me now. I'm gonna take you down. Go with me now. I'm gonna show you how. Go with me now.
Alright, welcome to the aggregate supply lesson as we continue the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Quick review though, how do these things affect the aggregate demand curve? So if Chipotle uses their profits to purchase new safety equipment, that would be an increase in investment spending, so the aggregate demand curve would shift to the right. There would be an increase. Consumers are penalized on their taxes for not having health insurance. Ooh, that's a hefty cost. That's going to cut down on my consumption spending, which means aggregate demand is going to fall. It's going to shift to the left. And then finally, if the government decides to fund daycare for all the children, that's going to be an increase in government spending, so the AD curve is going to shift to the right. So that's a quick little review. Today we're covering the aggregate supply curve. And to start us off, we need to understand that there is a short-run aggregate supply curve and there is a long-run aggregate supply curve. So let's draw what these things look like. First of all, the short-run aggregate supply curve is just an upsloping curve. Okay, you can put whatever slope on it you want. You can make it curve like I did. You can make it a straight line. Makes no difference. Okay, the long-run aggregate supply curve is a completely vertical line. Okay, so I've got them both labeled. And then of course we learned about the aggregate demand curve. I'm going to throw that guy in here. Okay, so that is what our graph looks like. As you can see, in the short run the aggregate supply curve is positively sloped, and what that means is there is a definite relationship between the price level and the quantity of aggregate supply that is produced. Alright, in the long run, however, notice that the slope is infinite. There is no relationship whatsoever between the price level and output. Okay, so I guess basically we need to remind ourselves of this. I think I've mentioned this in class before. It wouldn't matter if inflation was 100% per year. As long as our wages also go up at the same rate, then it wouldn't make any difference. And so there is no incentive to produce more at higher prices, because in the long run the prices don't actually matter. And so that's why our long run curve is vertical, but our short run curve does respond to changes in price level. So we'll look at that a little bit here. Alright, so when we talk about the long run aggregate supply curve, it exists where the natural rate of output is. Okay, so this is the rate of production achieved when the economy is fully employing all of its resources. So remember, I told you all before, the long run aggregate supply curve is essentially the same thing as our PPC. Okay, and because it's our PPC, it is our potential output. Okay, now I told you it corresponds to the PPC. We mentioned that. So mathematically, Y star refers to the natural rate of output, and that exists when the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. So we would not be at the long run aggregate supply curve if our unemployment rate was above, say, 5 or 6%. Okay, if it was 10%, we would not be on the long run aggregate supply curve. That's still our potential, but for whatever reason we wouldn't be there at that time. Okay, now let's look at the short run again. So we have a macro law of supply in the short run. And the macro law of supply basically says that there is a direct relationship between the price level in the economy and the aggregate quantity supplied. Okay, so remember, points along the curve. Alright, and I don't want to confuse you, but let's say aggregate demand crosses right here. That means that point on the AS curve is where we currently are. If the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, that's going to drive the price level higher, and then the aggregate supply curve is going to get a new point on it. Okay, so that is what we mean by aggregate quantity supplied. Now there's a reason for this. Okay, and this will, at this point, you'll probably just need to write this down and accept it, but as we go forward you'll begin to understand what this is talking about. Okay, so the reason for the upsloping aggregate supply curve is mainly sticky input prices. Now what this is referring to is the fact that as aggregate demand increases, producers can raise the prices of their output, but their input prices kind of remain where they were because they don't adjust in the short run. Alright? Now again, we'll explain this in a second. But what that results in are the second and third reason, which are basically related to the first. Because sticky input prices exist, there's an increased opportunity cost for not producing, and businesses have incentives to hire additional workers so that they can meet the needs or the demand of that increased aggregate demand at the higher price level. Alright, so again, we'll explain sticky input prices here. So resource prices, those are the things that businesses have to purchase in order to make goods and services. Typically wages. Wages is a good example of a resource price. Okay? So wages don't change every day. Output prices might. I mean, if you go to the gas station, the price of gas changes, pretty regularly, sometimes more than once a day. But the people who work at the gas station, their wages remain sticky. They don't change, okay? So they're fixed. Output prices, like we said, are more flexible, they're easier to change, and so those prices do go up. Alright? So let's do an example. Let me go ahead and put my aggregate demand curve, and let's go ahead and put an aggregate supply curve upsloping, and then let's pretend that for whatever reason there's an increase in aggregate demand. Okay? Here's our new curve. Here's our new short-run equilibrium. Now, at that higher price level, notice the price level at the new equilibrium is significantly higher than what it was at the original. So original was A, now we're at B. Alright, during that time, producers can raise prices of produced goods and services, but they don't have to increase the pay of their workers during that time. Okay? And so what we end up seeing is that producers produce more at the higher price level because their costs haven't increased, and so they can just take advantage of that distance between these two things and just call it straight up profit. Okay? So there's incentive to produce more at the higher price level. And so that's one reason why the curve is upsloping. As you move along it at a higher price level, there's going to be a greater aggregate quantity supplied. Alright, now let's look at the opposite. Alright, in the opposite we have aggregate demand falling. Now we have a new equilibrium at point C. Well, at that point wages remain where they were at point A. Okay, so the wages remain at 90, but the output produced is going to go down, and so the opposite of profit is loss. So if the businesses keep the same number of workers, they're going to be losing even more money, and so that's why in a recession we get higher unemployment. Okay, the unemployment rate goes up. So that's basically what we mean by sticky input prices. Output prices will adjust, input prices won't. Okay, now let's look at the actual shifters of the aggregate supply curve. Okay, the aggregate supply curve is going to shift anytime resource prices change. Okay, anytime the government implements policies that affect business, or anytime productivity changes. So we're going to talk about all three of those things, but essentially resource costs, that would be like if wages do change price, or oil prices, or any other inputs to production. If they change in price, you're going to see a shift in the AS curve. Now, let's make this more clear. If these things go down in price, you're going to see aggregate supply go up. Alright? Now the actions of the government, this is just talking about things like subsidies, taxes, regulations. Anytime the government puts in place taxes or regulations that affect business, that basically changes their cost. Okay? And so lower taxes are going to end up shifting the AS curve to the right. So lower taxes, AS shifts to the right. Higher taxes, AS curve shifts to the left. Okay? Same thing with regulations. If regulations go up, aggregate supply shifts left. If regulations go down, they shift right. Alright? So again, we'll look at those a little more closely in a second. And then productivity. This is really referring to technology changes. And the technology allows each worker to produce more goods or services. And so more technology, okay, increase in technology means we get an increase in aggregate supply. Alright, bottom line though is this. If you look up at this top right corner, whatever is good for business will shift the AS curve to the right. If something happens that's bad for business, it's going to shift it to the left. Alright, so here's some examples. A supply shock could be an event that obviously affects aggregate supply, but it could be anything from a drought, a hurricane, oil prices suddenly change. Those are all things that will affect the aggregate supply curve. All right. It looks like the images here are all depicting decreases in aggregate supply. Okay, these are all things that are bad for business. Now, don't get confused. High oil prices are good for oil companies, but they're bad for everybody else. Okay, so don't get confused about that. Now, here's another thing. This in economics, we always try to complicate it a little bit, but basically, anytime costs go up, aggregate supply decreases. But you got to be aware that there are different things that will cause costs to increase. So here's an example. What if we all think inflation is going to be 10% next year? That means at the end of this year we're all going to demand a raise so that we can maintain our standard of living. And so when we all demand a raise, that is the exact same thing as an increase in resource costs. Okay? So how does that affect the aggregate supply curve? Well, once again, let's draw everything out, because graphs really tell stories. So we think prices are going to be higher in the future, and so we demand higher wages today. That's going to shift the AS curve, the aggregate supply curve, to the left. And it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The fact that we expect inflation is going to cause us to demand higher wages. That's going to bring the price level higher and output reduced. Okay? So when I'm talking about output, I'm talking about the new equilibrium crossing the x-axis. When I'm talking about price level changes, I'm talking about the equilibrium crossing on the y-axis. Alright, so that's expected future price levels, how that can change current costs as far as wages go. Alright, sometimes we make a mistake though. So every once in a while we thought inflation was going to be 10%, so we got a 10% wage increase, and inflation was only 5%. So guess what? The boss is going to want us to give that back. Okay? And so we do the exact same thing in reverse. So our short run aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand. Now, because we're going to accept lower wages, the aggregate supply curve shifts back to the right. And that's going to result in more output and lower price level. Alright, so basically, here's what I need y'all to understand. We're going to be using this model for the rest of the semester, and you got to know how to make changes in the model without getting yourself confused. So here's what we do. We're always going to begin with the model in some long run equilibrium. So I'm going to go ahead and put this here, short run aggregate supply, and then I got my aggregate demand. Now, this is in long run equilibrium because the two curves cross on the long run aggregate supply curve. So everything is perfect in this economy. This is our natural rate of output at our natural rate of unemployment. Everything's doing great. Alright? Then you're going to determine, by whatever situation you're given, you're going to determine which curve is affected. So this is why we learned what shifts the aggregate demand curve, and today we're learning what shifts the aggregate supply curve. Do not make this complicated. Typically, only one curve is going to be shifted, so don't get all crazy and try to shift both curves every single time. Okay? Don't make it complicated. Alright, so then we shift the curves in the appropriate direction. So for example, we learned about aggregate demand last time. So if taxes are increased on individuals in this economy, they're going to end up buying fewer goods, and so the AD curve would shift to the left. Then you make your change in the output and the price level. Price level is lower, less output. That means there's going to be higher unemployment. Alright? So basically that's what we're looking at. I want you to understand what happens on this model when a situation occurs. All right, again, don't make it overcomplicated. All right, so let's do some examples of things that will shift the aggregate supply curve. All right, what if the minimum wage is increased to $15 an hour? All right, this is not going to affect the number of workers that exist, so it's not going to affect our ability to produce goods and services, but because the cost is higher, it's going to shift the aggregate supply curve. So we still have an ability to produce more, but we're not because of the higher price of the labor. And so that's going to result in a higher price level in the economy and less output. And that's why we would end up seeing higher unemployment as a result of an increase in the wage in that respect, because this level of output doesn't require as many workers. And so the unemployment rate is going to go up. All right, here's another example. All right, Ron Swanson tells us a story. He got his first job when he was 9. He worked at a sheet metal factory. Within 2 weeks he was running the floor. And then he laments the child labor laws are ruining this country. So what if this little girl here, her name's Rachel, what if she could get a job? What would that do to the size of our labor force, and in turn what would that do to wages? Okay, if there's more workers, wages will go down, because if there's more of something, it costs less. So that's going to shift the AS curve to the right. New equilibrium at point B, you're going to see a lower price level and more output. By the way, at that more output, we're going to need more workers, so the unemployment rate goes down. Okay? At least in the short run. Alright, here's another example. Alright, looks like some airstrikes hit some ISIS-controlled oil refineries in Syria, and that has increased the world price of oil. So if oil costs more, that means utility bills, electric bill, transportation costs, everything's going higher. And when something goes higher for a business, that's not good for them, so the AS curve shifts left. New equilibrium point B, higher price level, less output. Okay? Make sure you're making a note of these things, and sketch a graph if you need to, so you can visualize this. When it comes time for you to do it, you got to do it yourself. Alright, here's another example. Lower energy costs are good for business and will therefore shift the AS curve to the right. Okay, so the example, fracking. Fracking has made energy costs go down. So the short-run aggregate supply curve has shifted to the right. We're now at point B. We're now seeing a lower price level, higher output. At that level of output, unemployment is going to go down, because as we produce more, we need more workers. So the unemployment rate drops. Okay? How about this? Now we're on the A. This is the actions of the government. So these are things the government can do to either help or hurt business. So what if the government offers to subsidize American manufacturing for the next year so that we can better compete with China? Or, similar thing, what if the government offers a temporary tax cut for businesses? Those are all good for business, so the AS curve shifts to the right. Now we're at point B, lower price level, more output. At more output, we're going to expect there to be more workers needed, so the unemployment rate drops. Cool. Alright, the reality in the US is that we actually have very high corporate tax rates, and as a result the AS curve has decreased. And when we decrease the AS curve, we shift it left. We have a new equilibrium at point B. That equilibrium looks like there is a higher price level with less output. So GDP has decreased. Unemployment has gone up. Alright? So this is like the worst case scenario. So what if we were to reduce business taxes? Do you think the economy would grow a little bit? I think it probably would. Alright, let's roll. So it turns out the government actually has quite a bit of control, or not control, but influence over the economy. Okay, our government is the biggest it has ever been. And so the actions it takes has a profound effect on the economy. Just as an example, regulation alone in our economy costs us $1.9 trillion worth of GDP each year. That is about 10% of our GDP. So if you think about it, if we would reduce the unnecessary regulations, we would all have a much higher income. So this is kind of a big deal. Now, government regulation. According to this news article, President Trump has rolled back a lot of regulations. And so when regulations are removed, whether you think they're good ideas or not, whenever they're removed, the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. And we now have a lower price level, more output. Okay? So, big deal, right? Alright, let's talk about productivity. Productivity is referring, and we've already covered this idea, but let's go over it again. Productivity refers to how much can be produced from the inputs used in production. So mathematically, productivity is our real output divided by our inputs. Okay? So as an example, today it takes 7 minutes for a worker to do what it took a worker in 1890 1 hour to do. And so all of that extra productivity allows workers to do even more in an hour than what we used to be able to do. Okay? Per unit production cost is found by taking the total cost of inputs and dividing by the real output. So it's these two formulas here, they're related to each other, but they look totally opposite. Okay? So just be aware, per unit production cost is just the total cost of inputs divided by the real output, whereas productivity is the real output divided by the number of inputs. So we're going to do an activity here. We're going to look at SpongeBob and his ability to produce Krabby Patties. Alright? It says here that SpongeBob can produce 400 Krabby Patties in 8 hours. So the level of productivity is 400 Krabby Patties divided by the 8 hours of work. 8 times 5 is 40. That must be 50 Krabby Patties per hour. That's his level of productivity. Okay? So that's pretty straightforward, right? Now, it says that SpongeBob makes $15 an hour, right? So that means on a regular work day, let's say he works 8 hours a day, and he's paid $15 an hour, that means Mr. Krabs has to pay him $120 during his shift. During his shift, he produces 400 Krabby Patties. So how much does each Krabby Patty cost? Turns out, Mr. Krabs has a cost of production, at least in terms of labor, of 30 cents per Krabby Patty. Okay? So that's how we calculate these things. Now, what if productivity doubles through the use of a magic spatula? Now how many Krabby Patties can be produced in 8 hours? Let's redo our math. Now he's going to produce 800 of them in 8 hours, so his level of productivity is 100 per hour. Okay? He's still getting paid $15 an hour, so his daily wage is still $120. But now he's making 800 Krabby Patties, so the cost per Krabby Patty dropped to 15 cents per Krabby Patty. Okay? That's that answer. So that's kind of a big deal, right? Increases in productivity do decrease prices, and that is why the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. Okay? Now, everything we've done so far, we were talking about the short-run aggregate supply curve. Now we're going to be talking about how the economy moves to a new long-run equilibrium. Okay? And we'll also talk about what shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve. Alright? So when we talk about the long run, we are talking about what happens in the economy when all prices have adjusted. Now when I say all prices, remember input prices are sticky, right? Well, now I'm saying that those do adjust also. Okay, so input prices too. Now, here's what basically happens. Okay? Let's pretend that aggregate demand increases. Okay? As a result of that, we move to point B. Point B is at a higher price level. As workers, we're going to demand higher wages because we can't live on our same wage with a higher price level. And then that increased wage ends up reducing the aggregate supply curve. As a result, we have moved to point C. And so that's how the economy will adjust. Now, notice the little clown punching bag. What that's referring to is the fact that whenever you punch one of those little clown punching bags, it always comes right back to where it was. And that's the neat thing about the long-run equilibrium. In our economy, no matter what happens with the short-run aggregate supply curve or the aggregate demand curve, we're always going to find a way to come back to the long-run aggregate supply curve. So be aware of that. Okay? Now remember, in the solo growth model that we covered, we learned that economic growth is caused by changes in resources, changes in technology, and then strong institutions. Okay? So when that happens, I want you to be aware of what this graph does. Okay? Let me put it back in a long-run equilibrium. Dang it, I really am getting sick of these spikes. Alright, AD curve. If we get, let's say we get all of these things, we get more capital, new technology comes about, and we have lowered our taxes. Okay? As a result of all of that, here's what happens. The long-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. Okay? And the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift with it. Now, when that happens, we move here to point B. We were at point A. Alright, the AD curve stays where it was, but the really cool outcome is that we have lowered the price level and we've increased our output. So that's a big deal. Okay, so economic growth is always good because this is what happens. Okay, so let's demonstrate some long-run changes in output. So suppose the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. Alright, let's do that. Boom. This is like a redo of what we just did. LRAS2. Okay. As a result, we're going to get the AS curve to also shift. And now we are at point B. So we've reduced the price level, we've increased output. Now here's the one caveat. Basically, our Y star has just moved and our natural rate of unemployment stays the same. Okay, so we're just producing more output per worker. So in the short run, you will get unemployment changes when you deviate from the long-run aggregate supply curve, but in the long run, the unemployment rate remains at its natural rate. Okay, so if the long-run curve shifts, you don't get a change in the unemployment rate. You just get a change in GDP. So don't get confused by that. All right, so here's some examples. You could do these yourself, but if we get new natural gas, the internet is invented by Al Gore, or lower income taxes, those will all shift the AS curve, long run and short run, both to the right. Okay. Now let's talk about when you have negative growth. Okay. Every once in a while, something will happen to an economy where they experience a decrease in the long run aggregate supply curve. And so a really good example from recent history is the Japan earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear reactor meltdown. Alright, and we're going to see that a lot of capital was destroyed. These images you're seeing are real pictures, aside from the reptile. Anyway, also there's a lot of life lost, lots of labor was lost, and other resources were lost. Okay? So, let's look. In 2011, a record-breaking earthquake hit Japan, was followed by a massive tsunami. This disaster destroyed significant capital in Japan, including roads, factories, ports, and nuclear power plants. Alright, so as a result, the long-run aggregate supply curve shifted to the left, and the short-run aggregate supply curve traveled with it. And so now we are at point B. So, in Japan, they're facing a higher price level and less production. So this is their new natural rate of output because they've lost so much capital. Now as they rebuild and they gain capital, all of this will go back to normal. But it still is a long run situation because it's a long period of time for this to be affected. Alright? Now, let's demonstrate what happens when the aggregate demand curve shifts. How does the economy go back to its long run equilibrium? So don't forget, remember the clown punching bag, that's where we're going to always end up, okay? So let's see what happens. The AD curve is going to shift to the right as a result of the increased consumer confidence. Now we are at point B. Alright? But at that higher price level, so here we are at a higher price level, we as workers are going to demand higher wages, and so the aggregate supply curve is going to shift left. And that brings the economy back to its long-run equilibrium. Now you'll notice the price level now is even higher. Remember, in the long run, the price level doesn't really matter. Okay, if you'll recall, remember Grandma used to go to the movies for a nickel, and back then maybe their wage was a nickel a day. So it doesn't really matter that we pay $15 to go to the movies. All right, so the price level can go up and down throughout time. It's a matter of us producing what we're capable of producing in the long run, and so our long run equilibrium is what matters. Okay, so that's how the economy adjusts in the long run when there's an increase in aggregate demand. Now notice you could also have a decrease in aggregate demand. This is what happens during a recession. So let's look. Aggregate demand curve falls. Okay. Over time, if we remain in a recession, workers are going to begin to accept lower wages at that lower price level. When they do that, aggregate supply curve shifts right, because the lower wages allow businesses to hire more workers, and then they can produce more. And then that brings us to point C, which is now we are back at the new long-run equilibrium. Cool? Very exciting. Don't forget, clown punching bag, you always come back. Okay? So here's kind of a summary of what we just demonstrated. Okay? If there is an unexpected increase in aggregate demand, we start with an economy in long-run equilibrium. Remember, I told you to do that. So here's our short-run aggregate supply curve. Here's our aggregate demand curve. We're going to say that unexpected decrease in aggregate demand. So aggregate demand falls. New equilibrium here. You can see at the new equilibrium that there is a lower price level and there is less output. Okay? When there's less output, you're going to get higher unemployment. Okay? But the lower price level is going to result in businesses being able to hire more workers at lower wages. And so the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts back to the right. And so output returns to normal. Price level drops even further. And so that's how the economy will end up coming back to its long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, similar situation. Now we're going to see aggregate demand increase. Whoops, I went backwards. Notice I've got to always label my graph. Alright, so we're starting at a long-run equilibrium, and now unexpected increase in aggregate demand. So the AD curve shifts to the right. You are now at this new equilibrium at a higher price level. More output, there's going to be less unemployment. So now it's going to start costing more to hire workers because there's less unemployment. Also, at the higher price level, workers are going to demand higher wages to keep up with inflation. As a result, businesses are going to hire fewer workers, and then they're not going to be able to produce as much. So the AS curve shifts back to the left. And the economy is now back to its long-run equilibrium, where the natural rate of output and the natural rate of unemployment exist. Okay? So this is kind of confusing stuff. Going to require some practice to get it straight. I think this is the last thing we're going to cover, and that is how do short-run decreases in aggregate supply adjust in the long run. This one's probably less confusing, but basically, let's look at what happens. Alright, there is a short-run supply shock caused by an oil pipeline break. Alright, so the pipeline breaks, oil's gushing everywhere. That's going to cause there to be less oil available. Energy prices are going to go up. That's going to reduce aggregate supply curve. Okay? So we end up at a new equilibrium at point B. Eventually, the break is fixed. And guess what? The aggregate supply curve shifts back to where it was. and we end up back at point A. So that's basically what happens with the aggregate supply curve, the aggregate demand curve, and the long-run aggregate supply curve whenever the economy changes. All right. So, summary. This is in your notes, but basically, the long-run aggregate supply curve is not affected by the price level. Okay? However, it will shift when there are permanent changes in our resources, our technology, or our institutions. The short-run aggregate supply curve does depend on the price level because of sticky prices, so there is a positive relationship there. Okay? The short-run aggregate supply curve will also shift due to changes in resource costs, technology, and institutions, but those would be temporary changes as opposed to permanent ones. So, in the short run, the intersection of AD and AS are what determine what the current output and price level is in the economy. So, that means at any given moment, output can be more or less than the natural rate. However, that's only on a short run basis, because in the long run, we will always end up at the clown punching bag on the long run aggregate supply curve. Anyway, have a great day.
Come with me now.
Go with me now.